Hi, Geshe.
Hi, Laura. Okay.
Hello, everybody. Good to meet again. Great to meet again under these circumstances. Thank you for coming every week as a Sangha and enable us to study together this precious text. Thank you, Geshe, for teaching us for so long, and we really appreciate it. Thank you so much. Enjoy ourselves. Let's begin.
All right. Thank you, Laura. All right. So we start as we usually start with setting the motivation. And like I said last time, try to make an extra effort to go through the different stages as if you were to do it for the first time. So with special interest, special feelings, special effort. All right. We start as usual with some breathing meditation to let go of any disruptive thoughts. In the space in front of you, visualize the manifestation of great compassion and wisdom. The Buddha Shakyamuni, appears in the form of a fully ordained monk. Seated on an open lotus in the sun and a moon disk. And surrounding the Buddha are the lamas, the great masters of India, especially from the Nalanda tradition of Buddhism. Nagarjuna, Buddhapalita, Chandakirti, Shantideva, and so forth. Also visualize the great masters of Tibet. Passed on the teachings of the Buddha in an unbroken lineage to this present day. And also those of other traditions, other Buddhist traditions. Try to feel their presence, inspiring you and motivating you practice as they did. And think that they're inseparable. The Buddha and the other masters, inseparable from your Lama or your Lamas. And then surrounding all of us, the visualization and yourself are all sentient beings. Appearing in different forms with different problems and sufferings. Wishing for lasting happiness, but unable to find it. Always looking in the wrong places. And bring to mind that they're just like us. That their mind is controlled by misapprehension of the eye and other phenomena, and the resulting self-centered attitude. Responsible for all their problems. And so start off with generating affectionate love. So feeling of closeness and acceptance for each and every one as living beings. As deserving of our love, of our affection. And pay extra attention to the fact that they have a body and a mind that are the basis for all problems and difficulties. That with their present mind and body, they're bound to experience endless problems, pain, loneliness, fear, and so forth. generate the deep aspiration. May I be able to protect these sentient beings from whatever prevents them from attaining a state of liberation. And that way generate great compassion. And your compassion then grows stronger. It gives way to the altruistic attitude, which is the determination to lead sentient beings to a state that is free from suffering and its causes. A state of nirvana, liberation. And since in order to accomplish that, we need to become enlightened ourselves and generate bodhicitta. The aspiration, or even more so, the determination to become fully enlightened with the wealth of all sentient beings. I think that is with this motivation that I will today study Chandrakirti's entry into the middle way. And that's then do the prayers, and again pay special attention to each word and try to really feel that meaning as if you were to say it for the first time with great enthusiasm and feeling. Can we have the prayers? Oh yeah, thank you. Excuse me. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the accumulation of merits of practicing generosity and so forth, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the accumulation of merits of practicing generosity and so forth, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the accumulation of merits of practicing generosity and so forth, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. May all sentient beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May all sentient beings be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. May all sentient beings never be separated from happiness that is free from suffering. And may all sentient beings abide in equanimity, free from attachment for friends and hatred for enemies. And then directed specifically at the front visualization, reverently I prostrate with my body, speech, and mind. I present every type of offering, actual and imagined. I declare all my negative actions accumulated since beginning this time. And rejoice in the merit of all holy and ordinary beings. Please remain until the end of cyclic existence. And turn the wheel of Dharma for living beings. I dedicate my own merits and those of others to the great enlightenment. Okay, then for next week, what we've covered so far, we're still basically trying to get, first of all, a sense of equanimity. But in order for that equanimity not to be a sense of indifference, it's an attitude of openness towards all sentient beings, kind of moving towards a feeling of closeness, a feeling of affection. And in order to bring about that feeling, well, the last few weeks, we focus on, first of all the benefits that we reap from sentient beings, the importance of each and every sentient being. Without them, we wouldn't have all the benefits we have now, we will have in the future. We've also tried to enhance our sense of all sentient beings so that it's not just a small group of people, like just including humans, although there's so many of them, but of course sentient beings are countless. And to become more aware of the fact that there are many sentient beings whose presence we're not even aware of, being limited in what we can perceive. Therefore, there's so many more sentient beings. Even going beyond this planet, this Earth, and even within this Earth, forms of life that we just can't perceive. To become aware of that. But then today, I'd like to focus on one difficulty that we have to generate, or one of the reasons we have this difficulty to generate a sense of equanimity and openness towards all sentient beings, kind of being ready to take them on, as in taking them on in the sense of opening ourselves to them generating love and so forth. Well, one of the obstacles, one of the reasons we can't do that is that we have, first of all, a habit to classify people in 3 categories. Those we don't like, those we do like, and everyone else we don't care about. Those people who are neither the first nor the second, so we neither dislike nor do we like them, we just don't care about them. So we have this natural tendency, first of all, very quickly, we categorize people into, or we divide people into one of those categories. And we hold on to this. Usually we keep with that. Once that was this impression, we don't let go of it. And of course, it changes. It doesn't remain the same. A friend becomes an enemy. So the Tibetan word is enemy, but it doesn't necessarily have to be an enemy in the literal sense of the word. It's just someone we don't like. Maybe we hate them, we're resentful towards them, we just find them annoying or frustrating, whatever is our attitude, but we certainly don't like them, and we're not indifferent towards them in that, well, we neither like nor dislike them. So basically, we have that first impression, and from there it grows stronger, and we sit with it, we stay with it, and of course it influences our actions in daily life. So to make an extra effort to recognize, in particular, who are the ones we don't like. That's really important. And for this week, if there's someone, if it's just one person, there may be more than one person, but to make an effort to go through the people that are part of this category and deal with that. As in, like, well, if as part of your own practice, focus in particular on them and focus on the fact that whatever it is that annoys you about them, well, the causes and conditions that gave rise to it, possibly the circumstances they were brought up in, the cultural environment, or just their parents, or I don't know, some likes or dislikes that just don't happen to be the same as yours, whatever you can kind of come up with as a cause. And in that way, try to just understand why they are the way they are. And secondly, understand that, well, it's that underlying root cause, of course, that's controlling their actions, self-grasping, and more directly, self-centeredness, which then gives rise to afflictive emotions. And the fact that they annoy us, well, it seems that we suffer due to them, but depending on how they behave, if they're actually engaged in the actions that we perceive them to engage, like harmful and so forth, well, then they are more likely to suffer more than we do, even though that's not directly obvious. And so instead of having resentment, generating compassion. So to really spend time with that person. And also, every time you have a negative thought, either about this person who's part of this category or about anyone else, just watch your mind, be most attentive, and the moment you have that thought, replace it with a virtuous thought. Make an extra effort. So if there's a sense, oh, they're just so annoying, then make an extra effort to generate a mind like, well, but they're under the control of afflictive emotions, self-centeredness, and so forth. So may they be happy. May they soon be free from this, etc. So really make an extra effort with those we have resentment towards. And well, that being your main focus, but just depending on, well, some of you may not have this category. Maybe there's no one you really dislike. So also make an effort to bring in those you're especially attached to, those you feel you can't live without them. And make an effort to remove yourself, like step away a little bit and understand that the relationship you have with this person was at some point quite different before you met them for the first time. You didn't know about their existence. Or, well, if you believe in past lives and you think of your own children, well, then they were someone else's children in your past life, and there will be someone else's children in the future. And of course, if it's someone who was alive before you met them, then it's pretty easy to think along those lines. And to become aware that your happiness is not dependent on that person. You can be happy without them. And to just not letting go of your love for this person, but this feeling I can't be without them. So to work on that. Okay, so that's for you for this week. Please pay extra attention to those two categories of beings, and watch your own mind as well in your interaction with other people. As have I already categorized this person in that? Have I put them in that category? And maybe change the category. Maybe take them out of that category. In particular, if it's someone you're strongly attached to, or very have resentment towards. So don't put them in the category of those you're indifferent towards, but a sense of actual care and, well, a feeling of closeness, but on a level of the Dharma, if you can. All right, so that's difficult. That's a lot to do, a lot to pack into 1 week, but see what you can do, how much you can do, and don't forget to generate the mind of enlightenment, even though we're still working towards it by way of going through these different practices, but still, never mind. Make it a point again and again throughout the day to generate the mind of enlightenment. Start off, of course, in the morning and so forth. Okay, great. Then let's go back to the text. There wasn't any question so far. I went through Tal's question again. Just read through it. I think I've answered it, but just in case I didn't, just to, well, stress again that when he said there's no sense with regard to the self, that there is something totally independent, and there's no sense that there's a permanent self. Well, I would agree with you. There's no innate sense that there's an independent I. We don't have that sense innately. We just have a sense of something separate from mind and body, and that can give rise to a philosophical view that exaggerates that notion, as in like, well, there's a totally separate independent I, but we certainly have a sense of a permanent I every now and then. Sometimes it seems impermanent, sometimes permanent. Okay, but I talked about this last time. Anyway, that should be enough. I believe we got to verse 125?
Yes,
right? Including 25, exactly. So that's dealing with analyzing the I, analyzing, well, the self, the way it appears to us, in relation, of course, to the aggregates, and based on the view that non-Buddhists have, some of the non-Buddhist philosophers. Well, of course, the way they describe the self, we don't have a sense that the I exists that way innately. Maybe philosophically, we may believe in such an I. It doesn't have to be the philosophy of those non-Buddhist philosophers here. It could just be a sense of a permanent or some separate soul and what have you. So to become aware of that, we should become aware of that kind of view. But also our sense of a separate I, to kind of get in touch with that, to pay attention to whenever there's a feeling, oh, the I exists separately. And of course, the logic makes sense in this case. Well, it wouldn't make, that self, it should become clearer, it should become more obvious the more we search for it. But of course, where would that self be? Within the aggregates, what would that be? And it's impossible to find such a self. But then we move towards the other analysis that the text is going through here. If the self doesn't exist as separate from mind and body, it can only be one with mind and body. And I mentioned before that there are only two possibilities given as of the two. One with the aggregates or different from the aggregates. And the reason being, if the I, the way it appears to us, so I'm stressing this, I'm not talking about the I that does exist, but I'm talking about the I, the way it appears to us. So when I say I, it appears to me as an inherent entity. Now, with regard to that particular I, if it were such an inherent entity, that would mean it would exist independently. It would not depend on something other than itself. Now, if it doesn't depend on something other than itself, if it really existed the way it appears to me as an inherent intrinsic entity, then if it hypothetically still were to exist, it would be either totally separate from the aggregates, that is to say, independent of the aggregates, because we've just established that, what we've just talked about this, well, if the self existed inherently, it would be independent. So it would be separate and independently separate. So, or it would have to be one with mind and body, because to be dependent on itself, well, there's no problem. It exists intrinsically. So of course, being dependent on itself, there's no problem. But if it wasn't one with itself, and still existed somehow in relation to the aggregates, it couldn't be inherently existent because it would not be independently existent. So that's why there are only these two possibilities. From the point of view of the self that does exist, the merely labeled I, well, there's a third possibility, as you've heard. It's neither one with the aggregates, not totally separate, but it's of one nature. It's of one nature. It's merely labeled, but because it is labeled, we say it does exist, as in inseparably linked to the five aggregates, and therefore the five aggregates are dependent on it, and it is dependent on the five aggregates. Okay. Now, as to the I, the way it exists. So one point I want to stress, just for those who didn't listen to Yanden Rinpoche's teachings yesterday, Rinpoche gave some teachings. And something that came up in the text Rinpoche gave on recognizing the mother, or recognizing my mother. In this text, it warns practitioners to be careful, or to pay special attention, if you like, if you study about emptiness, if you study about selflessness, to not get caught up in the words, first of all, just getting caught up in the words, and to not misunderstand the fact that when it says in the texts, there is an I that does exist, so don't negate the I that does exist, and only negate the inherent existence of the I, that we are often just have the sense when we hear two things are separate, we very quickly see them as quite separate. So we may believe there's this inherent existence of the I over there, and the I being here. So the I that I perceive, there's an existent I that I perceive. So with this I should leave the way it is. And then there's inherently existent I somewhere over there that I need to negate. But what we fail to do is, what we fail to understand in that moment is that the I that we perceive, to us it appears as if inherently existent. So whatever the I appears to us, there's always this aspect of inherent existence appearing together with it. So if we want to negate inherent existence of the I, we have to look at the I the way it appears to us, because otherwise we're negating something that is not the inherent existence of the I, although we think it is. Maybe some, as it says in this text, it seems to be like a monster, the monster of inherent existence, which seems to be totally separate from the I. In actuality, of course, the conventionally existent I doesn't exist inherently, and so this made-up monster, of course, doesn't even exist. But to our mind, those two are inseparably linked. Therefore, we need to look at the I as it appears to us, and then take it from there. Can that mind, well, if it exists, either it's one with the aggregates or separate. Okay, having gone through the separate option, now let's look at the option of being one with the aggregates. And this is also a view that is found, a view that the I is the aggregates, so being one with the aggregates, as in like being the aggregates, that is found by non-Buddhist philosophers, by Buddhist philosophers of the different traditions. So we are here, of course, following the highest view, the Prasangika, and the Prasangika is the only school that sets forth emptiness in the way, well, according to the Buddha, according to Nagarjuna and Chandrakirti, so the emptiness we have to realize in order to become liberated and fully enlightened. And the other philosophical schools, of course, nowadays, there's, well, probably no one any longer around following their philosophy, but still we learn about them. We learn about them to get a better understanding of the highest view. And it's good, therefore, so in this context, to understand how they posit the I. So as I said, they posit the I to be one of the aggregates. Well, different views on that. Some of them believe the aggregates to be all the aggregates, all five aggregates, to be the I. Okay, mind, body, whatever is part of the person, that is seen as the I. Okay. And then there are some who pick a certain aggregate, a certain mind, that perceives, well, the I to be that mind. And it's all based on the view that there must be something inherently existent. There must be something there that, for instance, distinguishes me from another person. Okay, a sense that, okay, they're mind and bodies, but that's not the I. But there must be something there. There must be something there that I can say makes me me and another person someone else. Okay, so that sense gives then rise to well, if I say there's something there, I have to point at something. And these are the philosophers, other than the Prasangika school, the other philosophers of the different schools, Buddhist schools, they point at the aggregates. Where else are you going to point at? Something separate doesn't make sense. And we've gone through it. So if something separate doesn't make sense, it can only be the aggregates. Okay. Now, excuse me. Now, here, if you look at verse 126, Chandrakirti says, a self that is separate from the aggregates does not exist, as was established before. The object of the identity view, or identity view of the self-grasping of the mind that grasps at an inherently existent self, is thus the aggregates alone. Okay, so the object of according to the lower schools, it can only be the aggregates alone. Well, I should say this, like every philosophical school, Buddhist school, accepts an identity view that is a self-grasping, a mind that grasps at the self, but they differ a little bit. The Prasangika school very clearly holds on to a mind that perceives the I to exist inherently. But according to the other schools, that's not a wrong view, because the I exists inherently. So they do hold on to a self-grasping, but the self-grasping that they accept is not the subtlest kind of self-grasping. So the Prasangika school would also say it's a form of self-grasping, but they would say that's just a coarse form of self-grasping. That is not the subtlest form of self-grasping. And if you deny the existence of the self as asserted by the lower schools, you do get some coarse selflessness, but you don't understand selflessness on its subtlest level. Okay. Now, that sounds complicated, but it's not that complicated, because really all the lower philosophical schools, Vaibhashika, Satantrika, Chittamatra, and Svatantrika Madhyamika, those four lower schools, they all assert the subtlest selflessness to be the lack of a self-sufficient, substantially existent I. Okay, what is the subtlest selflessness? The absence of a self-sufficient, substantially existent I. It's not the absence of an inherently existent I, but the absence of a self-sufficient, substantially existent I. Again, very wordy, sounds difficult, but actually those two words, self-sufficient, substantially existent, are synonymous. As in, actually there's no self-sufficient I, there's no substantially existent I. But if there were such an I, if there was something that is self-sufficient, it would have to be substantially existent. And if it was substantially existent, it would be self-sufficient. So what do these terms refer to? Well, if such an I existed, if such an I, the way it is refuted by the lower schools, also refuted by the Prasangika school, except the Prasangika schools say the refutation of that is not the subtlest form of selflessness, but they also accept the absence of such a self-sufficient, substantially existent I. But we now try to identify what it means. It basically means, if it existed, first of all, there would be an I that is separate from mind and body, separate in such a way that it's the controller of mind and body, that it's that which controls mind and body. It's like a separate entity, not just labeled, but actually separate as in like without labeling, it's nonetheless there. So you don't need labeling for it to come into existence. Well, no, it's there. As a separate entity, it controls mind and body. If you could, of course, you can't exchange a self with another person's self, but it's so separate that if you could exchange it, if that was possible, I could implant my own self into another person's mind and body and maybe take on their I. Okay, and so I would take on a different mind and body. And more than that, even more than that, or another way to look at it, it'd be so separate that you could identify that self without having to rely on identifying one of the aggregates. So in other words, if such a self existed, so there's a wrong view that such a self does exist, we hold this wrong view. We're under the impression with this wrong we believe there's this separate entity that is separate from mind and body controlling them, and it would actually be possible to perceive this I without having to perceive the mind or the body. So you could bypass mind and body, and if you just look close enough, you would be able to perceive that I. That would be like seeing a car without having to see its parts, right? So if there was such a self-sufficient car, in the same way as with regard to the self here, if such a car existed, you could see a car without seeing any of its parts. It's that sense of an I. And as I said, we sometimes have that sense of an I. That's a very coarse sense of self-grasping. I'm watching myself. I'm in charge. I'm enjoying this and that. So there's not sense that that which is enjoying or utilizing or doing something is either the mind or the body, and we're just labeling the I on the basis of any of these aggregates. No, it seems there is this separate entity. Okay. And as if you could bypass mind and body and somehow meet that I, kind of come to see this I. And the lowest schools, Svatantrika, Madhyamika, all the way down to the Vaibhashika, they say the absence of such a self, that's selflessness. And the mind that grasps at the existence of such an I, well, remember, we discussed this before, I mentioned this before. That mind, of course, is a wrong consciousness. And a wrong consciousness always has a basis, a focal object that does exist. And based on that, that is misapprehended. Remember, I said, when you wrongly hold on to the horns of a rabbit, for example, there's a focal object that are the ears of the rabbit, and they do exist. And now they're wrongly apprehended to be the horns of a rabbit. If you take the subtlest self-grasping of the Prasangika school, what is the focal object? The merely labeled I, that's the focal object. And based on that, to the mind, it exists inherently. Okay. So, and we're not aware of that. We're not aware of that merely labeled I. That's just the basis. So it appears mixed, but it's the basis based on which I perceive that I to be inherently existent. So there's always an existent focal object that is then misperceived. that being the case, well, here in this lower school, in the lower schools that assert a self-sufficient, substantially existent I mean, that assert self-grasping to be a mind that wrongly perceives a self-sufficient, substantially existent I, what is the focal object? Well, the existent I, and which one is that? An existent I. So they would have to say, well, in this case, it's the aggregates. But it is a little bit more complicated than that. Now, here in this case, in the case of these philosophical schools that apprehend selflessness, or believe that self-centeredness refers to the lack of a self-sufficient, substantially existent I, because they don't accept that the lack of inherently existent I is emptiness, because they believe the I exists inherently. So actually, when we study this view, in particular here, when looking at comparing the Prasangika with some of the lower schools, which we do right now, we focus on the Svatantrika school, the Svatantrika Madhyamika school, which are closest to the Prasangika view. And to really understand the subject matter here, the following two verses, it's helpful to focus on them. The refutation that Chandrakirti offers here, if you think of it according to the Svatantrika school, Svatantrika Madhyamika school, it's easier understood, I believe. And with the other schools, it works similarly, but the Svatantrika, their views are clearest explained because we studied their views when we study the subject. So for the classical studies, you study Madhyamika only after you study the Abhisamaya Alamkara. And the Abhisamaya Alamkara, or Ornament of Clear Realizations, which is the text we study for six years or sometimes 7 years, depending on the institution, before you study Madhyamika, that is presented from the point of view of the Svatantrika. So for 6 years, you study the Svatantrika, in other words. Not so much emptiness, but it comes up again and again. So, and this knowledge is helpful now for this following, for the refutation that will be presented now. So let me just say this much. According to the Svatantrika, they say there is an imputed I, and there's a substantially existent I. I have to explain this because in the verses it comes up. So what does substantially existent mean in this context here? Substantially existent versus imputedly existent. Substantially existent versus imputedly existent. I already mentioned self-sufficient, substantially existent. Now, actually, the self-sufficient, the meaning of self-sufficient in the context of substantially existent and self-sufficient is not exactly the same as the meaning of self-sufficient here now in the context of the I. Okay, slightly different. So self-sufficient, substantially existent on one hand, and then just substantially existent. Because substantially existent and imputedly existent are direct opposites. And the Svatantrika school, they say some phenomena are substantially existent and some phenomena are imputedly existent. All right. So, well, actually in the Prasangika school, in the Prasangika school, self-sufficient, substantially existent, that type of substantially existent, and in general, substantially existent are not the same. In the Prasangika school, they're not the same because substantially existent is the same as inherently existent. Okay. And of course, everything is imputedly existent and nothing is inherently existent. But in the Svatantrika school, it's a little bit different. They don't equate inherent existent and substantially existent, because for them, everything exists inherently. However, they distinguish between things being inherently existent and between things being substantially existent. So it's a little bit complicated. Well, we had 6 years to get used to it, but of course you don't have that much time. However, so just this much you need to understand. In the Prasangika school, substantially existent means not merely labeled, it means inherently existent. So truly existent, substantially existent, inherently existent, same meaning. Opposite of merely imputed. So therefore, obviously, well, since things are merely imputed, they can't be substantially existent. That's Prasangika. Straightforward, not that complicated. Svatantrika, of course, is more complicated. They have to fit in more contradictions. Things are dependently risen, but they exist inherently. Since they have to fit in contradictions, all the lower schools are in themselves contradictory. They become more complicated somehow to wiggle their way around these contradictions. Okay, so you'll notice that some of the lower schools are more complicated for that very reason. So the Prasangika is very straightforward. And I wouldn't say all this if it wasn't for the verses to come. Okay, so I don't mean to confuse you. But anyway, it's part of learning philosophy, so might as well learn it. I hope Prasangika is clear. Substantially existent, inherently existent, same thing. All right. In the Svatantrika school, they say there is a substantially existent I and there is a imputedly existent I. Two eyes. Two eyes that both exist. I'm not talking about merely labeled I. I'm not talking about that kind of I, merely labeled, not inherently existent. No, that's the Prasangika school. No, the Svatantrika school say I exists inherently. Of course, nothing could exist unless it had some existence from its own side. That is a given. But then they do assert that there is, although it exists inherently, there's an imputed I. What is that imputed I? It's the I that when I say, for instance, I can see Leora, okay, the Leora I can see, that's the imputed Leora. Okay, the imputed Leora, that's the Leora I can see. That's the imputed Leora. But then there's a substantially existent Leora. This Leora I can't see, her mental consciousness. That is the I that exists. Remember? I said, other than the Prasangika school, all the other Buddhist schools, they say that the I is one of the aggregates. Okay, remember? It's one of the aggregates. Some say it's all 5 aggregates. And we say, why, that is not correct. We'll get into this. But some say it's all 5, and some pick one of them. And what are you going to pick of the 5 aggregates? Well, you're most likely to pick the mental consciousness. All right? And the mental consciousness, well, the Svatantrika school in particular, I mean, if I said the mental consciousness is the person, is my I, okay, in my case, it's no problem because I'm aware of my mental consciousness. But Leora is also a self, is a person. And if my mental consciousness is my self, then her mental consciousness is her self, is Leora. So if that was Leora, then it would follow, I can't see Leora because I don't see her mental consciousness. So because of that problem, I said, if you have a contradiction in your own view, you have to make it more complicated, right? It's a bit like you get caught in lies, you know, like when you say an untruth and then say something else, you get totally like entangled in everyday life. We have to kind of make new truth to kind of wiggle our way through. It feels a little bit like that, not that they're lying in that sense, but more like they're facing these contradictions. So I can no longer perceive Leora because Leora is her mental consciousness and that I can't perceive. So how do I account for the fact that I can see Leora? I can bump into her. I can talk to her. It's because there's an imputed Leora. The imputed Leora Okay, that's the imputed Leora. And she exists inherently. Although she's imputed on mind and body, because when I look for Leora, if I look for it, well, at least intellectually or at least conceptually, I come to find her mental consciousness without being able to perceive it, of course, directly. So my sense consciousnesses won't perceive Leora's mental consciousness, but mentally I can come to the conclusion, oh, if I look for Leora, I'm going to find Leora. That's her mental consciousness. Okay, so that's real Leora. You end up having to posit two. Does that make sense? That's the Svatantrika school. In the other schools, they end up having to say something similar, but Svatantrika, they explains it, or in the scriptures at least that we studied, it was their view that was presented in the clearest way. All right, so having confused you further now, two eyes. Leora has two eyes, and in a substantially existent eye and an imputed eye. Now, what's the difference? Why is one called substantially existent and one called imputedly existent? Well, imputedly, it's not that difficult. It's imputed in a similar fashion as in the Prasangika school, except, yes, it's labeled on mind and body, okay, but it still exists inherently. Okay, so they do accept it's labeled, but it's not just labeled. So we do label it on the basis of Leora. But of course, if Leora were not to exist inherently, then there wouldn't be any Leora, because I would just call someone on the basis of nothing. I would call something, I would talk of Leora, and there's nothing there. So there must be something there. And that's the mental consciousness. Now, the mental consciousness is not labeled. It is substantially existent. Why substantially existent? And here the meaning comes in again, as before with this self-sufficient substantial. Here the substantial existent in the Svatantrika school has the same meaning. In the Prasangika school, no. In the Prasangika school, self-sufficient substantially existent, that type of substantially existent, that you deny when you deny or when you refute a self-sufficient substantially existent I, that does not refer to inherent existence in the Prasangika school. Because when you realize there is no self-sufficient substantially existent I, you don't realize that there's no inherent I, right? So in the Prasangika school, they don't have the same meaning. In the Svatantrika school, they have the same meaning. Self-sufficient, substantially existent. So this substantially existent, that has the same meaning as Leora's I is substantially existent. What does it mean? That Leora's mental consciousness you can identify without having to identify anything other than that mental consciousness. No, you cannot, sorry, you cannot identify her mental consciousness without having to rely anything but the mental consciousness. That's their view, okay? But the other Leora, the imputed Leora, okay, the imputed Leora, I can only identify imputed Leora on the basis of her mind or body, right? I mean, if I see her face, I say I see Leora. Okay, when I hear her voice, I say I hear Leora. So the Svatantrika school understands that there is this imputed Leora, okay, but she's not merely imputed, that is, she also exists inherently, because the actual Leora is her mental consciousness. And to perceive that, I don't have to rely on something other than the mental consciousness. To identify the mental consciousness, I identify the mental consciousness and nothing else. Okay, but to identify imputed Leora, I need to identify her mind or her body, more likely her body, of course. Okay, so it's a little bit difficult. I've packed in 6 years of hearing this over and over again as part of the study we did, and we got so used to it. We debated this, we got used to it. Now it's relatively easily understood, or I understand it easier than, well, you will for now. Okay, having said all this, now let's look at the verses. Okay, so we've read verse 126. Now let's look at verse 127. 27, which is now refuting this position, the position, well, any of the Buddhist positions that any of the aggregates is the I. All right, that's 27. Now, if the aggregates are the self, so the first two lines are easy. Then, since there are multiple, since there are many aggregates, the self would have to be many. You're all familiar with that reasoning. No big deal. That's not difficult. Okay, so you're all familiar with that. If the aggregates are the self, because there are many of them, then the self would have to be multiple. And then the next would be, and the self would also be substantial. The self would also be substantial. So that would mean here, with regard to the self, let me just look for it. So it would mean that the only self there is the substantial self. Okay, if the I is that, so if the I is the actual aggregates, just a second. So the problem with that would be their view that there's also a labeled self. That wouldn't make sense, because really the self, so this is the Prasangika school now refuting the Svatantrika view. They would say your whole idea of a self that is imputed, what is this? It doesn't make any sense. You're already saying that the self is the aggregates. So you're just wriggling your way around, kind of coming up with this imputed self. But in actuality, there's only this substantially existent I. That's the only I that is there. And the difficulty implied in that is then, well, how can I say I see Leora if I see her body? Because there is just no way. They say that the mind is substantially existent. They actually say that consciousness is substantially existent. It's not imputedly existent. So if the self is the mind, is the aggregates, in this case, the mind in particular, well, it has to be substantially existent. And this whole idea of Leora being imputed, that is just words. I mean, they do assert that Leora is imputed, also, of course, because it says it in the scriptures. The scriptures, the Svatantrika school in particular, shares scriptures with the Prasangika school. So the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, where there are quotes again and again, the I is labeled, its mere name, and so forth. So there are these quotes. And the Svatantrika, for one reason, is that it says in the scriptures it's imputed, but the other reason is really they have to account for the fact that you can see another person just by seeing their body. But the Prasangika school says that not in those words, but it's basically saying then the I has to, it doesn't say, well, it doesn't make sense that you accept an imputed I, but really that's what's implied. So the self would just have to be substantially existent. It would be substantial. There is no imputed I. And therefore, how do you identify Leora? How can you identify her? How can you see another person? So implied in that. Viewing it would not be an error. So therefore, if you perceive the I as in substantially existent, that would not be an error, that would not be wrong, because, well, they talk about there is no self-sufficient substantially existent I, but if there's only that I, okay, if there's no imputed I, because actually they have to take as the basis for the self-sufficient substantially existent I, that basis has to be the imputed I. That has to be the basis, really. Otherwise, then there would be no error, because the the self-sufficient, that self-sufficient part, it's given. And in a way, that mind, the mental consciousness, is like a controller, if you like. It does control mind and body. And you can identify this mental consciousness without having to identify anything else. That's what they accepted in the first view. So then this view of a self-sufficient substantial I would not be an error. It would not be wrong. And it would be a correct perception. So your selflessness would not hold, because really what you believe, this substantially existent I, that's really the self. And it exists as a substantially existent I. So it wouldn't be an error, because doing so would pertain to a substantial reality. Okay, so your I is a substantial phenomenon. Anyway, so that's 127. It is actually arguing on the basis of the Svatantrika view. Okay, so it's a little bit complicated. I realize that, and I apologize for that. It's just because, well, that's according to Benjison Dakpa, the way we learned it. I'm not sure it's all the same. The same explanation with regard to the Svatantrika school, according to Jetsun, Shugi Gyaltsen, etc. I'm not sure, but I wouldn't be surprised that it is that explanation, that according to the Svatantrika school, there's a self-sufficient I and there's an imputed I, and that distinction does not make sense. Okay, it's basically here taking it apart with verse 127. First, the self would just have to be substantial. There wouldn't be an imputed self. Then viewing it would not be an error, because the view of a self-sufficient, substantially existent self, that being a wrong view, according to the Svatantrika view, is based on the imputed I. But if there's no imputed I, that doesn't make sense, because that's being refuted here by the Prasangika school. Well, then, if you view the self-sufficient I based on the self-sufficient mental consciousness, sorry, not the self-sufficient, the substantially existent mental consciousness, where's the error? Where's the error if it is substantially existent? And so, therefore, it would pertain to a substantial reality. Okay. It would definitely, so this would not be wrong, and that would be the reality of the self. Okay. So really, just to summarize, the Svatantrika view of an imputed I wouldn't make sense. Okay. But if they say there is no imputed I, they do have the same problem as mentioned before. Then this, and this would also be helpful for us, because the question arises again and again: why is the mental consciousness not the I? It's not just the Svatantrika that holds that, but when Westerners, when teachings, or Westerners, any student of the Dharma, when they are introduced to this comparative study, Svatantrika versus Prasangika, and they hear the mental consciousness is the I, they always ask, why is the mental consciousness, why is the mental consciousness not the I? And the answer would be, well, where does the body fit in? Okay. In what way do we say, I saw Leora? In what way do I say, I'm sick when my body is sick, right? If the mind is well, okay, like let's say I have like a skin cancer, for instance, right? No pain, just skin cancer. So my mental consciousness is not affected, okay? I couldn't say, if today I found out I had skin cancer and I've had it, if the doctor tells me, well, I must have had it for a year now. And I'm like, I was sick for a whole year. I wasn't aware of it. So there was no mental consciousness that was worrying about my skin. And so there's nothing that makes it, that there's no reason for me to say, oh, I had skin cancer, because, right, my body wasn't affected. There was no pain. And where's the connection between mind and body, right? Just because the mind is connected to this, well, lots of bacteria are connected to this body, and I still wouldn't say that if it happens to my body, it happens to the bacteria, right? Oh, my body is sick, so all these bacteria are really sick. I have skin cancer, so all the bacteria have skin cancer. No, I wouldn't say that. Although they're inseparably linked to my body, right? Still, I wouldn't say, okay. So very difficult, unless I were to say the mind is merely labeled on the basis of the five aggregates. I couldn't, nothing I do. I walk, because my legs walk. Okay, the mind is involved in the process of walking to the degree that needs to be a motivation. But any reflex, right? My heart is beating. Got nothing to do with my consciousness. It's not like, come on, beat, right? Or blood pressure or what have you. I mean, these reflexes in the body, okay, you may argue there is a motivation, but well, that's a whole different debate. The point being, any physical activity, anything to do with the mind, you see my body, you see me, if you see my body, no, you don't see my mental consciousness. So, okay, so that's also a reasoning that's part of this. And of course, a lot of people wonder, why are the five aggregates not the person? Okay, that will come up again. Of course, later on, we'll go through the analysis of the eye. But as part of this, why is it not all five aggregates, all parts of something, the collection of parts? Well, why is it not the collection of parts? Because if all parts were the person, I could no longer say I think. It would no longer be correct to say I think, because my little toe is not thinking. If the collection of my parts, the collection of my aggregates were the eye, if the eye does something, they all have to do it. It's just all of them, okay? It's all of them. If my eye were all of them, if the eye does something, they all have to do it, okay? We'll have the chariot later on, or the car if you want to use the car, whatever, like some vessel of transportation that will be used later on in the text as the chariot, arguing not all the parts of the chariot. Well, no, because if the chariot breaks down, not all the parts of the chariots have to break down. And if you see me, you don't have to see all the parts. In fact, you see only a very few parts, okay, to be able to see me, as an example. So it cannot be all the aggregates. And we'll go through this in the meditation in a moment. So I spent a lot of time now with this whole substantially existent and imputedly existent. Did you really need this? Well, no, only just to understand verse 127, okay, the argument here. But it's still useful. It is still useful in the sense that however confused you got, one thing you understand, the Sautantrika has to make it more complicated because of their contradictory views, okay? So they add something to it. And of course, the Prasangika school, like substantially existent versus imputedly existent. So hopefully this has become a little bit clearer how the view of just the aggregates, the mental consciousness brings them into trouble, the trouble just described. And of course, there's more to it, and I've added a little bit more to it. As I just said, if the mental consciousness were the person, then the body would be how does the body fit in there, of course? And if all five aggregates, which we are most likely to believe, there's again a problem. All right, we got a little bit more time though. So let me do the next verse, because I believe it's a little easier to understood, but once I start explaining, I may feel that's actually quite difficult, depending on how much I need to say. Okay, in 128, it says, if the I were the mental consciousness, let's not forget, it's not just that, it exists inherently according to the Prasangika school. And if it exists inherently, what happens at the moment of nirvana, when you reach nirvana? At least your mind is no longer the same mind. Of course, there's a continuum. There's a continuum there. There's a moment, there's now, when you reach nirvana. Nirvana is not the end of everything. Your mind continues, of course. Nirvana just means the absence now of afflictive emotions, because you've eliminated the root cause of these afflictive emotions. So that's just the absence of that. But your mind continues on. So your mind continues on, but the self was previously the sixth consciousness, and the sixth consciousness, the self being inherently existent, it means it's in and of itself, it's in and of itself that mental consciousness, that's the I, and it's self-sufficient, it exists, well, self-sustaining, I should say, self-sustaining, as in like, it doesn't need anything really to exist. But when that is gone, the self is gone, because It was the same as the mental consciousness, and that mental consciousness existed inherently as the self. And when that's no longer there, the next moment, you no longer have a self. It's actually the argument that if something exists inherently, then if it stops, then it's gone for good. You can't talk of a continuum, because a continuum implies that it's labeled. If the self is the continuum, each moment is totally different. Each moment is completely different from the former moment. I mean, in that it's a different entity. It exists at a different time. They may share a lot of similarities. So when we look at it, the continuum of a car, for instance, of course, I don't notice that yesterday's car and today's car are not the same. To my mind, they appear the same way. But of course, on a molecular level, it's completely changed. And if it's changed on a molecular level, it's changed. But the fact that I can still say yesterday's car and today's car, it's both a car, it's a continuum of a car, is because I label car on all these moments. That is okay if you merely label. But if yesterday's car were an inherently a car, and it would stop to be yesterday's car today, then today I would have a totally new car. It would be a totally new car, because yesterday's car is gone for good. It's gone for good. And yesterday's car was not just labeled, it was inherently a car, and it's no longer there. So that one inherently an existent car is gone, and suddenly I get a new inherently existent car kind of popping up. Okay, so as long as yesterday and today's are similar enough, I may get away with it. But when I reach nirvana, when nirvana is attained and the mind is very different now, well, the self is gone. Because yes, the self was the sixth consciousness since beginningless time that was afflicted. And now it's a non-conflicted mind. So that's gone then. Okay. And prior to nirvana, there would be this self popping up and going away. So it's kind of really what Chandrakirti is arguing. Well, the self has been the afflicted self since beginning this time. So that's the self. It's inherently the self. And when you reach nirvana, there's no longer a self. Okay. And then prior to nirvana, from moment to moment, the self is changing. And it's really like becoming a non-self. It's gone. And the new self totally popping up, because it's not just labeled. It's in and of itself. Each moment is in and of itself an I, a self-sufficient, self-sustaining, self-contained I, doesn't depend on anything else. And when that's gone, it's gone. Okay. So with no agent, none of its effects could be. So in a way, that means the I that accumulates karma today and the I that experiences it, there's really no connection. They're totally disconnected. We had similar arguments before, right? The Prasangika brings these arguments again and again, right? There's no connection between the seed and the sprout, okay? If they existed inherently, they'd be totally separate. Okay, remember we had this, like, from anything can arise if there's no connection, if they exist inherently as inherently separate. So here the argument is similar in that whatever I accumulated in a past life, a totally different person experiences. There's no connection between the two of them. And none of the effects could be, and acts would be done, karmic actions would be accumulated that another person would reap fruit, the fruits of, or the results of which would be reaped by others. Okay, because the I in the Prasangika school, there's no problem. Of course, from moment to moment, the I is not the same, but the eyes may be labeled on those moments. So we label I on the I of the previous life, and we label I on the I in the next life, just from my perspective, right? My I in a previous life, my I in the future life. There's a connection. There's a connection there. But if they existed inherently, they'd be like totally different entities. And people have asked me this question. It's really interesting. It's come up in debate, in courses, in classes, when someone said, if I accumulate karma now, what do I care? In the future, it's going to be someone totally different, right? That's really almost like on this basis that there's this inherent I right now, and in the future it'll be a totally different inherent I. It's not going to be the I now. Okay. But actually, that is true from moment to moment. If you think along these lines, well, the person tomorrow experiencing the pain that will be experienced tomorrow, if I chop off my finger today, is not the same, right? It's not going to be the same. And still, I wouldn't chop off my finger today. Why? Because there's a continuum. No, tomorrow, the person experiencing the pain tomorrow will not be the same, right? Today, me is not me tomorrow. And still, I wouldn't chop off my finger because there is a continuity of a mind. There will be a mind suffering tomorrow, okay? And that's the only mind I control, my own mind. And I have compassion for myself in the sense, like, I don't want to suffer myself neither. So this mind right now, the mind that thinks I don't want to suffer right now, that mind doesn't want to suffer tomorrow either. And for that reason, I do not chop off my hand today because of the pain tomorrow. I mean, in this moment, but also tomorrow's pain. Okay, anyway, that should be enough. I didn't go much through the text, but there's a lot to explain, but we covered 2 verses at least. So just to wrap it up again, since I've talked about a lot of things, really the argument here is, if the mental consciousness, so we've seen that the I doesn't exist separate from the body or the mind, well, then the other option would be it is mind and body, or at least one of the aggregates, or all of them, but it cannot, well, since it can't be separate and there's no other possibility, if it exists the way it appears, well, that's the other option. But there's a whole big, I mean, there's all this trouble that arises, definitely with regard to now the imputed I, that you also have to posit somehow. And if you don't, the difficulties arise as in verse 126. And moreover, if it existed inherently, just the inherent existence, taking that as one aspect, then when there's nirvana, well, the mind is quite different to before, totally free from all the misapprehensions. So the self would be gone, because since beginning of time, it has been that mental consciousness, and it's inherently that. And so it couldn't be anything other, therefore that would be gone. And in fact, even prior to nirvana, it'd be like these different independent selves popping up. There's no real relation between them. And if there's no relation between them, and just assuming, of course, that the mental consciousness is changing and being different, well, then you accumulate karma one day and then totally different self experiences it. So really karma isn't fair, because it's someone else experiencing what that one self has done in the past, right? Okay, so that's the argument, and it needs some analysis, I guess. So now we got some time to reflect on this. Okay, so let's start doing this. Sorry, I'm a little bit longer than usual. Anyway, so let's all take a deep breath after all this confusion, possibly. Just let go of any disruptive thoughts, and for a few moments, just focus on the breath. Now, with regard to the way our selves, that is our I, appears to our mind is such that if it existed, that I would have to be separate from the aggregates, or it would have to be one with the aggregates. There's no third option. And having previously understood that it's impossible for the I to exist separate from mind and body, since such is not findable, such an self cannot be found, inherent I, the way it appears to us, would have to be one with the aggregates. Which is what the Buddhist philosophical schools that accept inherent existence believes. Some followers of the Vaibhashika school believe that all five aggregates are the I. While others, including the Svatantrika Madhyamika, hold that the mental consciousness is the I. And if that was true, the mental consciousness were the I, how could I say, I put on weight? Or someone saw me? what would be the connection between the mental consciousness and whatever happens to my body? And which mental consciousness, where the I anyway? Especially when there are two mental consciousnesses arising at the same time. Or when a subtle mind arises while I'm asleep. Is that now a subtle I versus a coarse I? And how about the sense that, or the view that all five aggregates are the I? Wouldn't I end up with many I's, multiple selves? Since there are at least two aggregates, mind and body. And furthermore, if all five aggregates were the I, and if someone saw me, they would have to see all five aggregates. If I were sick, all parts of the body, all parts of the mind would have to be sick, as they're all the I. Whatever the mind does, the five aggregates, the other aggregates would have to do. Since I'm doing it, and the I is all five aggregates. or for me to do something, all 5 aggregates would have to do it. And so see whether you can come to the conclusion that just as it's impossible for the eye, the way it appears to me, the way it appears to us, that it cannot exist separate from mind and body, it also doesn't make sense that it exists as any of the aggregates. And thus, the eye, the way it appears to our mind as an inherent eye, is simply impossible. And since it is the inherently existent I that our self-centeredness is holding on to, our self-centeredness is holding on to something that has never existed and will never exist. Worrying, looking after something that's simply not there. Now, in conclusion, spend a few moments on whatever feeling, whatever insight has arisen as a result of this analysis. And just focus on that. And then let's dedicate whatever batches potential we've accumulated today. First of all, towards the long life of our spiritual masters, like His Holiness the Dalai Lama, Jada Rinpoche, and so forth. and towards our own enlightenment. May we realize emptiness directly at some point and eliminate with that wisdom all the obstructions to Buddhahood, the welfare of all sentient beings. And may it also help right here and right now. Those who are sick, like Tali Lubin, those who are losing their freedom, like those people in Afghanistan, many people in Afghanistan right now. And of course, as described in Shantideva's dedication prayer, may all beings everywhere, plagued by sufferings of body and mind, obtain an ocean of happiness and joy by virtue of my merits. May no living creature suffer, commit evil, or ever fall ill. May no one be afraid or belittled with a mind weighed down by depression. May the blind see forms and the deaf hear sounds. May those whose bodies are worn with toil be restored on finding repose. May the naked find clothing. May the hungry find food. May the thirsty find water and delicious drinks. May the poor find wealth. Those weak with sorrow find joy. May the forlorn find hope, constant happiness and prosperity. May there be timely rains and bountiful harvests. May all medicines be effective and wholesome prayers bear fruit. May all who are sick and ill quickly be freed from their ailments. Whatever diseases there are in the world, may they never occur again. May the frightened cease to be afraid, and those bound be freed. May the powerless find power, and may people think of benefiting each other. For as long as space remains, for as long as sentient beings remain, until then may I too remain to dispel the miseries of the world. Okay, great. So lastly, just remember your homework. Of the two, the person you have resentment towards and the person you're attached to, work mainly with the person you have resentment towards, the way I described before. And if you also can tackle those you're attached to, very good. As part of this process of generating equanimity towards others, and from there, of course, a sense of closeness and acceptance towards all sentient beings. And don't forget bodhicitta. All right. Have a great week and see you again next Sunday. Be safe.
Thank you.
Thank
You're
you.
welcome.
Thank you, Shema.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you, Shema.